What's up, guys? Neil Orfield here, and I'm going to show you how I will be setting up my fantasy cruncher for tonight's showdown slate between the Ravens and the Saints. This is for DraftKings, and I'll be setting up for the largest field GPP. So some of the steps I'll be taking in this video are steps I wouldn't be taking in a cash game setting or for smaller field GPPs. Things like leaving salary on the table, getting unique with players, not necessary in cash games or really small field GPPs, but for the largest field GPPs is what I will be setting up for. While you're coming in, please do hit that like button. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel. Help us out a lot. All right, let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is rearrange my columns so I see what I want to see in the middle of the screen. Looks like I may already have them set how I want them to. I have a quick view saved. Yeah, I don't think any change there. I just want to see in the middle of my screen ownership projections, projections that I have for each player, exposure caps, and then how much I actually get of players once I have run a crunch. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run a crunch with no randomness and no settings on using my projections. I'm just going to crunch out 10 lineups and see what kind of salary the top projected lineups use. And it looks like they're using over 49,000 for each of them. These are the top projected lineups. Okay, so they all use pretty close to the salary cap. Not many of them actually use the full salary cap. That is good to know. From here, I'm going to go into my captain spot. So I'm going to the captain tab up here, clicking into it, and I'm going to set an exposure cap for my captains. I took a look at the single game tool. We don't have anybody in the optimal in the captain spot optimally more than 20% of the time. I'm going to set my cap at 20%. It's all about how many different captains you want to use. I'll be making 150 lineups, so I like to spread out my ownership a bit. And there's nobody on this slate who looks like a sure thing top captain. So I'm just going to set my cap at 20%. Probably the number that I use the most in these spots. So now I won't be getting more than 20% of any captain. If you wanted to get to 100% Lamar Jackson or 100% Alvin Kamara, more power to you. Nothing wrong with that. You could leave this at, 100% or set it low for everybody else and put in a higher number for individual players in this column. A lot of ways to approach this, but for me, I'm just going to set it at 20% and leave it there. All right. Most of the work I do is going to be in the advanced options tab up here, in the general tab here, and the groups tab. Starting in the general tab, unique players per lineup, I'm leaving at one unique player per, so that means my lineups could be one player different from each other. That's because I'm doing 150 lineups. If I were making 20 or fewer lineups, I would probably set this to 2 unique players per lineup, but for 150 I'm going to leave it at 1. Team salary, I'm not going to set a minimum salary. If a lineup projects well enough but leaves a lot of salary on the table, I like that. That means it's probably a pretty good lineup and probably not going to be duplicated a ton by the field. I am going to set a max salary, so I'm not going to be using the full $50,000 that DraftKings allows you to use in salary. The only reason being I want to avoid being duplicated. Sometimes if you use close to the full salary cap, you're going to run into lineups that are going to be duplicated hundreds of times, and then even if you are lucky enough to win, you're not going to win that much money. So I would rather make lineups that when I do win, which takes a lot of luck, no matter what your lineup looks like, I want to have a shot to win a lot of money. So I'm going to leave a little bit of salary on the table. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to leave $1,000 on the table. Each slate is different how much I actually leave, and it's up to you how much you want to risk. If you the more money you leave, the more salary you leave on the table, the riskier it is, the less likely you are to win. But also the more likely it is that when you win, you're going to win big. So it's all about your risk tolerance. If you want to have the greatest shot of winning some money on the slate, don't put anything in this field. Just leave it open, and you can use up to the $50,000 salary. I like to leave some salary on the table for large field GPPs so that I have a shot at winning big money when I do win. So for here, I'm just going to start kind of in the mid-range, leaving 1,000 on the table. Probably avoid some of the most duplicated lineups. Probably will run into some lineups still that are duplicated a good amount, but not the most duplicated. Offensive players versus defense. The default is set to max 2 players versus the defense. I'm going to change that to 5 players. So I could theoretically have 5 Ravens against the Saints defense or 5 Saints against the Ravens defense. It's not something I'm going to see in my lineups a lot in this game, I don't think. But if it comes up a couple times, projects well enough, I don't mind that. I think that there are paths for that kind of lineup to win. We saw it win on FanDuel just last week. So it's certainly something that can win, and it's usually not going to be duplicated a ton. People, don't like the idea of playing the defense against an offense that's doing really well. So, and I get it. I get why people have that hesitation. But because it's not owned very much, and there are paths for that kind of lineup to win, generally with a defensive touchdown, or just the one of the offenses really sputters and doesn't put up many fantasy points at all, but the defense gets a couple sacks, maybe an interception. There are ways for the defense to be the highest scoring play or the highest scoring point per dollar play from a team. So I don't mind having 5 players against a defense in some lineups. Global exposure cap, I'm leaving at 100%. As you saw, I did change that to 20% in the captain spot. I am going to do things like mess with projections a little bit, or use the thumbs up, thumbs down to get to. Generally, I don't want to actually have 100% of a player in my lineups. This is a slate where you could, if you wanted to get to 100% Lamar Jackson. Honestly, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Typically, I don't use 100% of players across my lineups. That's also kind of a risk tolerance thing. But I'm going to leave this at 100% and adjust later if I need to. Randomness. I have randomness. Oh, I do have randomness on. I thought I had turned that off. I think I have it at 0% though. Anyway, I'm going to use normal distribution randomness. I have Fantasy Cruncher Pro, prefer normal distribution randomness, and I am going to use 50% here. If you are using classic randomness, if you don't have Fantasy Cruncher Pro, nothing wrong with that. I used classic Fantasy Cruncher for years, for a couple of years. You can, I would generally recommend using slightly lower randomness, maybe 30 or 40%. Just makes it a little bit easier to adjust and get to exposure caps, exposures that you like of different players if you use a lower randomness. I've actually thought about lowering mine just for the sake of making it a little bit easier to get to where I want to. Maybe I'd have to crunch out fewer times. So for now, I'm going to stick with 50% randomness in using normal distribution randomness. And again, if you lower that number, it's going to be easier for you to maneuver, get things exactly how you want them in Fantasy Cruncher. I leave a little bit more up to chance by using a higher amount of randomness here. Guys, we have a great offer for new users only. You can get full access to everything Stokastic has to offer for NFL for 3 days free. Projections, ownership, 1v1 tools, lineup generator, top stacks tool, all free. Zero risk. Sign up now. The link is in the description of this video. Note that Fantasy Cruncher is an add-on and is not included in this offer. Minimum projection included in calculation. The default is set to 3. That means that if a player projects for fewer than 3 fantasy points, they will not be in your player pool. I'm going to leave this at 3. And if there are players who project for fewer than 3 fantasy points, but I think I do want them in my lineups, I'm just going to manually adjust their projection to make sure that it's above 3. Thumbs up, thumbs down. I leave this at 8%. I think that's a good rule for, if you use the thumbs up, thumbs down feature, you are bumping a projection up or down by 8%. That's a good number there. And players from each team max, I'm leaving at 5. So I could have 5 players from one team against just 1 player from the opposing team. I don't mind having some of those lineups. All right, now I will go into groups. And generally, the most important groups are going to revolve around quarterbacks. And we have some pretty different quarterbacks here with Lamar Jackson and Andy Dalton. Lamar Jackson, obviously a great rushing quarterback. So you don't necessarily need to pair him with any pass catchers. So for Lamar Jackson, I'll show you. I have Lamar Jackson in the captain spot. I'm going to make him my key player. And then for this group, so this group is only for lineups that have Lamar Jackson in the captain spot. I'm going to go ahead and add all of these Ravens pass catchers to a secondary group. Demarcus Robinson, who I believe is questionable still for tonight. So I'm going to add him to the group. If he, is ruled out later on in the night, I don't mind having him in my lineups. He's just going to have a projection of 0. I don't mind having him in this group. He's going to have a projection of 0 if he does get ruled out. So he's not going to get into my lineups anyway. So it doesn't really hurt to have him in this group. And I'm going to add, actually, I don't think I need to add Mike Davis necessarily. Really, the only pass catching running back on the Ravens is Kenyon Drake, the only running back who gets any real volume of pass catching. So maybe I just need Kenyon Drake in this group among the running backs. Okay. And for Lamar Jackson, because he is such a great rusher, I am going to only apply plus minus adjustments. And I'm just going to give boost to his pass catchers when he is in the captain spot. So I'm not going to require that Lamar Jackson be paired with a pass catcher because I think that he has the upside to be the optimal captain just by rushing a lot. But I am going to make it more likely that I do get to, at least one, sometimes two pass catchers in lineups that have Lamar in the captain spot because there's obviously a lot of positive correlation between quarterback and pass catchers. So this is just going to make it more likely. And for Isaiah Likely, because he projects so well point per dollar, 5,800, 12.64 fantasy points, I'm not going to give him a full 12% boost like I am with these other players. And Kenyon Drake, because he's a running back, same thing. I think I'm just going to give smaller boosts to these guys than I did for the rest, because I don't want to run into like every single Lamar Jackson captain lineup that I have. I don't want to have Isaiah Likely and Kenyon Drake in there. And the higher I set this number for them, the more likely it is I'm just going to have these guys in every single Lamar Jackson captain lineup, and that's not what I'm looking to do. So I'm going to give them smaller boosts. All right, I'm going to name this group Jackson captain. New group for Andy Dalton in the captain spot. And Andy Dalton is a very different quarterback than Lamar Jackson. Doesn't have nearly the same rushing upside, so it's going to look a little bit different. So, I'm going to find Andy Dalton in the captain spot, make him my key player. So again, this group is only for lineups that have Andy Dalton in the captain spot. I'm going to add all of these Saints pass catchers to the secondary group. Jarvis Landry, also questionable currently. We'll have to see if he plays later on. But again, I don't mind putting questionable players into these groups. If they are ruled out, they're just going to have projections of 0. So it doesn't hurt me to have them in these groups. Even if I give them a boost, 12% boost on 0 is a 0% boost. It doesn't hurt me. All right, I'm going to add Alvin Kamara to this group, and that'll do it. With Andy Dalton, I am not going to click this button. I do want to have at least one Saints receiver in every lineup that has Andy Dalton at captain. With his price tag and the amount that it's going to take, he's going to have to put up significant fantasy points to be the optimal captain. And Andy Dalton's not putting up significant fantasy points on the ground, so he's going to need at least one pass catcher is going to have a great game if Andy Dalton does well enough to be the optimal captain, and most likely multiple will, because Andy Dalton again doesn't have a ton of rushing upside and he has a pretty high salary. If he's just throwing it to one receiver over and over again, that receiver is a lot more likely to be the optimal captain because on every passing play, the receiver scores more fantasy points than the quarterback. And on DraftKings, it's kind of significant. I mean, they get a point per reception. So, 125-yard pass, the receiver gets 1 point for the reception plus 2.5 points for the yardage. That's 3.5 points for the receiver. It'd be 1 point for Andy Dalton. The only points that he gets is the 25 passing yards. He gets 1 point for 25 passing yards. So the receiver gets a lot more points on every passing play than the quarterback. Really, the only way for a quarterback to be the optimal captain, if they're not a rushing quarterback, is to be spreading the ball around to multiple receivers and scoring touchdowns with multiple receivers. So I prefer to have multiple receivers generally when I have Andy Dalton in the captain spot. I'm not going to require it. Every quarterback pretty much has at least some chance of falling into the end zone, getting a QB sneak at the goal line, that kind of thing, ways to get there without bringing along multiple pass catchers. But generally, I would prefer to have multiple. So although I'm not requiring it, again, these boosts are going to make it more likely that I do get to multiple pass catchers when I have Andy Dalton in the captain spot. And I don't think any of these guys project so well point per dollar that I'm going to shy away from giving them full boosts. The only one I would think about is Chris Olave, but we'll see. I'll see if I'm getting too much Chris Olave in my Andy Dalton captain lineups, and maybe I'll adjust later. And then Alvin Kamara, just because he is a running back, typically I give smaller boosts. He also projects extremely well. Point per dollar, it's not that crazy of a high projection, but he has I believe the second highest projection on the slate behind Lamar Jackson. So maybe just a smaller boost for Alvin Kamara. And then finally, I'm going to make a group for Andy Dalton in the flex spot. I don't think I even need to make this group for Lamar Jackson. I think that it's very plausible for Lamar Jackson to be optimal in the flex spot without bringing along any pass catchers. He doesn't need to be, the highest scorer on the slate. He just needs to put up a pretty good score. And, Lamar Jackson is just going to project really well. So I'm not even going to make this group for Lamar Jackson. But for Andy Dalton, I'm going to go ahead and make a group. Andy Dalton in the flex spot, make him my key player. And I'm going to add all of his pass catchers once again. I just added Jordan Howard. I don't really know that I need to add any of these running backs outside of Kamara. Ooh, and Taysom Hill. That's a questionable one. Do I want to include Taysom Hill? I don't usually include players who are listed at quarterback, but I think Taysom might be an exception. I'll include Taysom as a potential pass catcher as well. He has not been targeted a ton this year, but did score a receiving touchdown a couple weeks ago. It's questionable whether you should really include Taysom in this group. I'm going to do it for now. I might end up taking him out later. I'm going to have to take a look at some of his stats, because if he has, 2 targets on the year, maybe it's not really worth including Taysom in this group. And as you can see, because I have Andy Dalton here in the flex spot, I'm adding all of these pass catching options in the captain spot as well. All right, that will do it. I'm going to remove Jordan Howard. Okay, so generally I'm just requiring at least one pass catcher from the Saints in every lineup that has Andy Dalton in the flex spot. I think that's good enough. I don't think I even need to give boosts to any of these guys. I just want to make sure that I have at least one pass catcher whenever I have Andy Dalton in the lineup, because it's just so unlikely that he's going to get there on a full PPR site without bringing along at least one pass catcher. All right, so that will do it for these groups. Another group you could consider making is, for example, you could make a group that has every Saints pass catcher in the captain spot. Or I guess I wouldn't include Alvin Kamara in this group, but every wide receiver or tight end in the captain spot, and then say at most one other pass catcher in the flex spot from the Saints, or maybe at most 2 and give negative boosts. There are a lot of different ways to do it, but because if you have a Saints wide receiver or tight end in the captain spot, that probably means that they're getting a lot of volume. They're probably the ones scoring either multiple touchdowns or getting, over 100 yards, getting a lot of volume. And that is going to negatively impact the other receiving options for the Saints. So you could make a group, for example, that says if you have a Saints pass catching option or receiver or tight end in the captain spot, you give a negative boost to all the other pass catching options, or use at most once, or at most 1 or 2. A lot of different ways to approach it. I'm not going to make that group right now. That might be something after I look at my lineups. If I am getting a lot of lineups that have Chris Olave in the captain spot, and then also have Juwan Johnson and Jarvis Landry and Traquan Smith. If I saw a lot of that, I would probably come back and make that kind of group to disallow it or to make it less likely. But I don't think that's going to be a problem. So I'm just going to make these 3 groups for now. All right, so I'm going to save these settings. And before I do anything to projections or anything, I'm just going to crunch out 100 and see what they look like using my projections. All right, so Kamara with Olave, Lamar Jackson. No real negative correlations there that I'm worried about. All right, Josh Oliver in the captain spot with Isaiah Likely, so at least one other pass catching option. But then Kenyon Drake's a running back. Dalton has Kamara as his pass catcher. Yeah, I think this all looks fine, correlates well enough. Isaiah Likely in the captain spot, just one other Ravens pass catcher, and Lamar Jackson. Andy Dalton with 2 pass catchers. That looks good. Lamar Jackson at captain has 2 pass catchers and the kicker. Andy Dalton paired with Chris Olave looks good. I think these all look fine. None of these lineups look like they have no path to win. For example, a lineup that would look to me like it has no path to win would be Andy Dalton in the captain spot and 0 Saints pass catchers. I just don't really see a way for that lineup to win without like an extreme outlier performance with Andy Dalton maybe catching a touchdown on a weird play and then rushing in a touchdown. It's just those kind of lineups are so unlikely that I don't think it's worth playing them. So I'm not allowing them in my lineups. But I think in general, I don't see anything that stands out to me here as this lineup has no chance of winning. And those are the things that I'm avoiding. I'm trying to make sure that all of my lineups at least have some path to winning. Andy Dalton, the captain spot with just Alvin Kamara in the flex. I allowed it, and I think I'm okay with seeing it a couple times. I think that there are paths to this being optimal. It's a little bit tougher with Alvin Kamara because he's so expensive. Trying to think, I guess Andy Dalton could throw a touchdown to Chris Olave and a touchdown to Alvin Kamara. And Chris Olave is expensive enough that I think, if he has 3 catches for 50 yards and a touchdown, he still might not be optimal, but then he does help Andy Dalton outscore Kamara. Plus, Andy Dalton is actually cheaper than Kamara. So I do think that this lineup has a path to winning. Here's another one, Andy Dalton with just Kamara. If I see too many of those, I might reconsider, do I really want to have a lot of those lineups? Whereas just Andy Dalton, I am getting to a number, as you see here. Andy Dalton with just Jarvis Landry. I'm getting to a number of lineups that have Andy Dalton in the captain spot with just 1 pass catcher. I prefer to have 2 in there. I could go back and just give bigger boosts to the Saints pass catchers in lineups with Andy Dalton in the captain spot, or I could change it to, use at least 2. I think I would be more inclined to, because I don't mind having some of those. I think I'd be more inclined to just give, slightly bigger boosts to pass catchers in lineups that have Dalton in the captain spot. But I don't even think I'm necessarily going to do that. I don't think it's totally necessary. All right. I also want to check. So I'm going to click on this to look at Andy Dalton captain lineup specifically and see if I'm getting to too much of anybody in those lineups where it's a concern. So getting to 38% Kamara. Okay, I don't mind that at all. 72% Chris Olave in my Andy Dalton captain lineups. Not really the end of the world. Surprised I'm not getting to any Traquan Smith in those lineups or Marquez Callaway. So maybe that's something to look at. Maybe I need to give those guys bigger boosts so I get to a little bit more of those guys in lineups with Andy Dalton in the captain spot. Guys, we have a great offer for new users only. You can get full access to everything Stokastic has to offer for NFL for 3 days free. Projections, ownership, 1v1 tools, lineup generator, top stacks tool, all free. 0 risk. Sign up now. The link is in the description of this video. Note that Fantasy Cruncher is an add-on and is not included in this offer. So I'd go back into my advanced options, groups, Dalton captain, and I didn't get to any. I mean, these guys don't project that well, so it kind of makes sense that I'm not getting to any of them. I probably need to actually adjust their projections. Actually, I think I'm not even going to bother doing this right now. I'm just going to adjust projections for these guys because I think I'm just probably not getting a ton of them at all. So that's probably the bigger issue than the correlation piece. Yeah, I have 1 Traquan Smith lineup, naturally 0 Marquez Callaway. So that would explain why I'm not getting to them in Andy Dalton captain lineups. So anyway, these lineups project well enough correlate well enough for me. None of them look like they have no shot at winning. So then the second piece that I'm looking at correlation and I'm looking at exposures on different players. So in the captain spot, I set an exposure cap of 20%. Getting to 20% Lamar, naturally getting to nearly 20% Andy Dalton. And I should point out here, part of the reason that I'm getting to nearly 20% Andy Dalton is because of those boosts that I've given. I've said, when I have Andy Dalton in the captain spot, give boost to all of these pass catchers. So that's going to make those lineups project better, and I'm going to get to more of those lineups. What you could do if you want to give those boosts, make sure that your lineups correlate well, but also don't want to get an absurd amount of quarterbacks in the captain spot. You could come in and just within the captain tab, give a thumbs down to Andy Dalton, and then you won't be getting to an absurd amount of Andy Dalton in the captain spot. But typically, I don't really mind having quarterbacks in the captain spot. I think that they often are optimal captains. I just made the mistake couple weeks ago, Andy Dalton was actually the quarterback in question, where I did exactly that. I gave him a thumbs down to get to less than 20%. And then, of course, he went all the way off and I did not win. So that was unfortunate, but that's going to happen sometimes when you make decisions, even if they're the right decision, not always going to work out. Uh, yeah, so I'm spreading out, as you can see, spreading out my captains quite a bit here. 18% Isaiah Likely I saw earlier. He looks pretty good in the tools. Going to be a positive leverage spot for Isaiah Likely. And then these quarterbacks, and of course, Alvin Kamara, always viable. All right, in the quarterback spot, I'm getting to 33% Dalton, 67% Lamar Jackson. Seems fine to me. We just saw Andy Dalton on the slate that I was just talking about. He got like 14% ownership, something like that. He's projected for a lot more on this slate. I don't know exactly how much I'm going to want. I'm getting to 0% Taysom Hill currently. Taysom Hill is one of those guys. I think he's probably the hardest player to project in all of football, just because he plays so many different roles. It's really hard to know how the Saints are going to use him week to week. I don't think that I want to get to 0% Taysom Hill. Maybe you do. Maybe he's negatively leveraged enough that you just want to roll with, maybe he's just not going to be involved this week. I think that I would have an issue with it. I don't really want to get to 0%. So I'm probably going to give a projection boost. So change this projection a little bit, see what comes out. Typically, I recommend, if you are new to Fantasy Cruncher, just using the thumbs up, thumbs down to give smaller boosts until you get to the amount that you want. I've done this for a while, so at this point I mess with projections to get to exposure caps that I like sometimes. Always keeping in mind the original projections and looking at the single game tool to figure out exactly how much I want of different players. But I do mess with projections just a little bit, keeping in mind what the original projections are at all times. Getting to 48% Kamara, right in line with the field there. 43% Kenyon Drake seems okay to me. Justice Hill getting to 24%. I'm not actually going to be making any player decisions here. I'm trying to just show you how I set up my fantasy cruncher and how I kind of think about it as I go. Currently, I couldn't get any of these 4 running backs. So you have to think, do I want any of these guys in my player pool? And maybe you want just Mike Davis to be in your player pool. He's getting 2% ownership. Doesn't have a good projection, but at this price tag, just one touchdown would pay it off. So maybe you want to give a little bit of a boost to Mike Davis. Make sure he's above 3 fantasy points so he's in the player pool, and try to potentially get some. We've got no Mark Ingram for this game, so you could consider, is Jordan Howard going to take over that Mark Ingram role? Is Dwayne Washington going to take it over? I don't think we know. These guys are, I think, both in play. Maybe I'll just give all these guys a little bit of a boost, get them into my potential player pool at least, and see what happens. I think that I probably will be playing some of these Saints running backs beyond Alvin Kamara, just because even though we don't really know what their role is going to be, have to imagine they're going to be a little bit more involved with Mark Ingram out. Of course, Taysom Hill could also be just taking over that RB2 role. Hard to really know what to expect, but I'll probably have some of those guys I would expect. Chris Olave getting to 48% seems okay. Devin Duvernay, now the wide receiver 1 for Baltimore, with Rashad Bateman out. Maybe I want more than 11% there. Get a little bit of a projection boost. Marcus Robinson, currently questionable. Maybe if he ends up playing, I'll give him a boost to try to get 2 more DeMarcus Robinson. I'm not going to do it right now. If I did change his projection right now and then he were ruled out later, sometimes it will reset to 0 naturally. Sometimes it would leave in the projection that I have. So I just don't want to worry about that. I'm not going to give him any kind of a boost right now. Jarvis Landry, we have project for 0% ownership. I believe he's still questionable though. Yeah, the latest is that he's questionable. So I think this will change if he is ruled in, obviously. Rashid Shaheed, going to give him, I'd have to give him a pretty significant boost to get him into my player pool. My guess is that this projection will go up naturally if Jarvis Landry is ruled out. I'll have to just go back and reset these projections later, but I will, give him a little bit of a significant boost, get him into my player pool. Same thing with Marquez Callaway. James Prochet getting to a good amount as the wide receiver 2 for Baltimore at 3,800. Price is right. We're getting to 41%. If I don't do anything to his projection here, most likely I'm going to get less of him this next run because I'm boosting everybody else. It's going to make James Prochet's projection go down relative to everybody else. And that's really, projections are all relative to each other. So naturally, I'll get to less James Prochet if I give boosts to all these other pass catchers. Something to keep in mind if you do get into doing what I'm doing, where I'm changing the actual projections. Again, if you're new to using Fantasy Cruncher, maybe start by just using thumbs up and thumbs down to get more or less of players as you like. Isaiah Likely, of course, projecting extremely well with Mark Andrews out. I'm getting to a ton of Isaiah Likely. I don't know that I really want 68% necessarily, plus the 20% that I have. I don't think I want 88% Isaiah Likely necessarily. Maybe I do. I mean, he's taken over the Mark Andrews role, and he's only 5,800, and he is a talented rookie. So maybe it'd be fine to get that amount. My guess is I'm going to be coming down on that number throughout the day, but I'll leave the projection there and see what happens. I haven't really changed projections at the high end much, so it's possible that I still do get a lot of Isaiah Likely, maybe even more because I'm giving bigger boosts to these cheaper guys. Makes it easier to get in some of the higher end guys. Again, these things I'm doing right now, I haven't really thought about whether I'm going to be using JP Holtz or Nick Boyle later on. I'm just getting these guys into my player pool, and I'll make those decisions after I write my article, after inactives come out. These things are going to change as we go. If I don't make any changes to the kicker projections, because I have changed projections elsewhere, I'm going to get significantly less than this. So maybe I'll just give these guys slight boosts to make sure that I'm still getting to a simple amount. And defenses, again, not making these decisions right now. Just want to make sure I have some of these guys in my lineups, and I'm going to crunch again and see what happens. All right, still getting about the same amount of defense, kicker, still getting a ton of Isaiah Likely, still not getting to a ton of Juwan Johnson. Maybe you have to give a bigger boost here. I'm not going to go through this whole process right now. I've said it before, sometimes I'll crunch 30 times. I think I've crunched 40 times at times on these slates before to get to exposure caps that I like and make sure my lineups look the way I want them to. I'm obviously not going to go through all of that work. This would be a very long video if I did. And I haven't really done the research yet, so I can't really tell you exactly how I'm going to be approaching this slate from a player standpoint. I'm just trying to show you how I set up my fantasy cruncher. Hopefully you will be making different player decisions than I will tonight. If you want to hear what I will be doing, I'm going to be writing an article later today. I'm also going to be on live before lock. So if you want to hear my actual player takes, I'll be giving them throughout the day. This video is just showing you how I set up my fantasy cruncher, how I use it to make my lineups, the different settings that I use. So I will be adjusting later on some of my projections. Again, if you're new, maybe just use the thumbs up, thumbs down, with the exception of players who project for fewer than 3 fantasy points. You're going to have to actually manually boost their projection. But other than those guys, typically the thumbs up and thumbs down are going to get you to where you want to be in terms of exposures. But that is a question I'll have to ask myself later on. Okay, 9% Taysom. That looks a little bit more reasonable. Just getting to a little bit lower than the field. I think that he's probably a player who we have over-owned in our sims. Yeah, so we've got him optimal 8.6% of the time. So maybe it'd be fine to be a little bit under the field. I don't know if I'm going to do that. I'm a sucker for playing some Taysom, but I'll make that decision later on. Anyway, that's all I'm going to do for this video. I'm not going to keep crunching these out over and over. I'm just showing you the process. I'm going to, throughout the prior to lock and after inactives come out, I'm going to be, making adjustments then to my actual projections until I get to exposures that I like on each player. And I'm just going to go through tab by tab, looking at each position. How much am I getting to each player? How much do I want of each player until I get to exposures that I like, and make sure that my lineups remain correlated well enough, which so far looks like they are. So that is my general process. Hopefully you can find some success tonight using this or a similar process. Good luck.